Good morning. I'm looking at us. I don't seem to have anybody else. Bear with me for a minute.
Judy Molyneux.
Hello. What's going on?
Here's the list, okay?
Say again?
The list for the top.
Oh, okay. Yes.
We did not connect your menu. I tried to call Brooke and Amy and they never answered.
Okay, I'll give them a call.
So,
I'll give them a call. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm not getting Plainview online. Is Amy around? No, Plainview called me to ask for help because they couldn't get hold of anybody. I mean, I can call, I don't know where the problem is. I can call the text the region and see if they can fix it. I'll do that, but, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. Bye. They're both out on emergencies, so.
We're on now.
Okay, outstanding. Outstanding. Bear with me for a minute now, I gotta get some things adjusted on this thing, on my end. Life is complicated, isn't it? Okay. Welcome, Plainview. Let's see if we can get this show moving here. Who's got notes? What's the last thing you've got in your notes? I just looked at the recording a second ago, but 25 things have happened since I started doing that. Had we talked about Alexander Hamilton yet and doing his reports to Congress yet?
I think so.
You don't think so? Okay. Bear with me for a second, I'm gonna...
Oh, yes, we did. It's right here.
You got it?
Yeah, it's right here.
Did I finish it? Did I give you a full report? Any other comments? Do you see anything that I said after that?
I don't know.
Not really? Okay. We were talking about George Washington's presidency, and you can, when you look at a presidency, you can either look at all the domestic things first, you can look at all the foreign affairs. Sometimes they cross over each other. Let's look at foreign affairs. I don't know if I told you the strange story about the French ambassador in America, Citizen Genet. Did I tell you that? It's been a while. Okay, let's do that. Let's start it that way. We'll talk about foreign affairs, and then we'll cross back over and talk about domestic. Washington served 2 terms of office. He was elected the first time in 1789 he was elected, so in theory, let's see, 1789 is when he goes into office. So 1788, I guess you could count that, and he's going to run for office again in 1792, and he'll leave office after the second term. And the main thing he's got to do is just make the country work, because, and he's probably the only man that could do that, because people were pulling in all different directions, but almost everyone was either respectful or afraid of George Washington. He commanded the entire war effort for 8 years, and after that had more or less retired to his home. He solved the problem of the constitutional or the Articles of Confederation by agreeing to be the chairman of the committee that wrote the new Constitution, although he really didn't do much except lend his name to it. So he's going to have to do a number of things, and let's talk about we talked about Alexander Hamilton, and before I start talking about foreign relations, I want to point out that there were a couple of things that came from Hamilton's report. Hamilton wanted us to do a couple of things. He wanted us, all the states, to start off with a clean slate, no debts from the war. So he wanted the federal government to pay those debts off. That's going to start a little bit of an argument with some of the anti-federalists. He also wanted to establish a national bank. That's going to start a little bit of an argument with the anti-federalists. So we're in the middle of that set of slides called the Federalist Presidents. And we finished the Hamilton's presentations. And the arguments that we're going to have were basically in between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They got along, they were civil and all of that, but they had different points of view on what the Constitution was supposed to do. Madison kind of felt the Constitution was supposed to limit the functions of the federal government. Hamilton thought it was a tool to make it possible for him to help the country grow. The assumption of state loans was complex because of this. The states owed money and the federal government owed money. We owe debts, about in between $50 and $60 million, internally and externally, to foreign countries and to local lenders. Actually, we owed the most to local lenders, people like Robert Morris. And he insisted that whatever money the federal government owed, they pay at face value. This is going to start a little bit of a brouhaha with Madison, and some people will even accuse Hamilton of being corrupt. Why? Well, a lot of the debts that the federal government had incurred were debts to the veterans. They owed the veterans pay. Remember, they got those certificates? But most of the veterans had sold those certificates off at pennies on the dollar. And now all those pay certificates were in the hands of speculators who had the ready cash to buy them. And they wanted the money back at face value. So let's say a speculator buys a certificate for 25 cents, but the face value is $1. Now he wants to be reimbursed a whole dollar, even though he only paid 25 cents for it. And a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people are insinuating, but not saying out loud really loud, that Hamilton must have a lot of friends that were speculators that were holding on to those certificates, and that's why he insisted that they be paid back at face value. Hamilton's argument was, if we don't pay our debts in full, no one will give us credit. The other thing about assuming state loans was the southern states had already paid off their debts. They paid off their debts because they had agriculture. Their agriculture was not destroyed or really disrupted by the American Revolution. They had slave power. The North didn't have that. The North's income was mainly from foreign trade, things like whaling and industries that involved leaving the country in ships. And that had pretty much ended for 8 entire years during the American Revolution. And so those northern states and their economies were just growing back very slowly. They couldn't pay their debts. But the southern states felt, gee, we've paid our debts off. Why should you take our tax money to pay the northern states' debts off? So Hamilton figures a way around this. And he says, if we give the northern states any money, we'll give the southern states the same amount of money, even though they don't need it to pay debts. That should be fair. And to sweeten the pot, he said also, we'll settle where the capital is going to be permanently located in a place that the southern states like. And he focuses in on the banks of the Potomac River. It's kind of a swampy place down across the Potomac from Alexandria, Virginia. It's more or less located in between Maryland and Virginia. And with that added sweetening of the pot, the Anti-Federalists buy into it, and they sign off. This is called the Compromise of 1790. And it takes care of the payment of the debts of all the states' war debts, and it locates the capital on the banks of the Potomac River. And it's still a swamp, even though it's a more attractive swamp now than it was then. The other part of the argument, the other argument he has to do with the National Bank. And the anti-federalists say Article 10 of the Constitution says that if it's not specifically a right given to the federal government, then it's the business of the states. But Hamilton comes back and says Article 1, Section 9, write this down. Not the Article 1 section, or Section 8, you don't have to write that down, but it's called the Necessary and Proper Clause in the Constitution. And basically it says that the Constitution, even if it's not specifically stated, the federal government can do what is necessary to facilitate getting done its tasks that are put forth in the Constitution. So, if we need to regulate interstate commerce and things like that, to do that, we need a bank. That's his argument. He's going to win that argument. He's going to win that argument. There's a lot of people on both sides that are for the bank. There's a lot of people on both sides that are against it, but Hamilton's going to win that one. The only bad thing about these two compromises is that you clearly see that there's getting to be two opposing sides in this lash-up. They were all together and united because they were veterans of the Revolution. But now you see this split. Sometimes it's north and south, sometimes it's east and west, and Washington's going to have to deal with that. We'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, let's talk about it now. 3 things that he has to take care of during his presidency. Let's get that up there so you see it. He's going to have to deal with the Indians up in the Northwest Territory, who were kind of helped along and urged along by British outposts up there. He's going to have to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. That's a rebellion against Hamilton's suggested tax on alcohol. And he's going to have to deal with the Barbary pirates, and we don't have a navy, so we're going to have to build a navy. That's more or less domestic. The domestic part of the naval thing is getting the money to build ships. In foreign affairs, we'll talk about them in a minute. Let's talk about the fallen timbers. What's that all about? Well, in 1790, Washington sent a group of volunteers out to try and deal with the Indians on the border. They called it Hammer's campaign. You don't have to write that down. It won't be on the exam or anything, but it was led by a general by the name of Josiah Hammer. He got whooped by the Indians. That didn't do any good. The following year, in 1791, Washington will send out the regional governor, who he makes a general, into a general, guy by the name of St. Clair, and he gets his butt whipped, and he loses about 1,100 men, casualties in that fight. So it's a big fight. Finally, he turns to one of his strong generals from the American Revolution, Anthony Wayne, and he says, build yourself an effective military unit and go out there and deal with it. During the war, he'd send General John Sullivan, and he'd done a pretty good job. Now he's going to send Mad Anthony Wayne. Now let's see if I can find a map. I got a map on here somewhere I'll put up for you. Where did it go? It's in here somewhere. There it is. If you look at the left-hand side map, you can see the Northwest Territory. That's where this is going to happen. And if you see a bunch of blue dots, they look like little blue houses. Those are British trading posts. And if you think about borders and all that, most of them are really on American territory. But they're in uninhabited areas where there's no settlements or anything yet. And the British are supposed to have withdrawn from there, but they're still there. And I think they're egging the Indians on a little bit. If you look at the right-hand map, you see 3 little like bomb explosions, red marks there. The one to the furthest south is St. Clair's defeat, happened in 1791. The next one up happened in October 1790. That was Hammer's defeat. But in 1794, when Mad Anthony Wayne takes his 2,600 men, plus some Kentucky riflemen out there, he's going to win a decisive victory up near the far western end of Lake Erie at a place called Fallen Timbers. The reason it's called Fallen Timbers, there was a big storm the year before and trees were knocked over, and so there's this big, kind of an empty place that was cleared by Mother Nature, and that's where they fight their fight. And they're going to win it. Now, they're going to sit down and negotiate with the Indians eventually in 1795. You've got to remember, what you always have to remember is, when we negotiated with American Indians, is who did we negotiate with? Because no one owned the territory really, and they didn't believe in that sort of thing. And no one was in charge of all the Indians, because they didn't believe in that sort of thing. So you had to kind of pick the people you negotiated with and hoped that they were influential enough to make this work. And what they did was they promised them $10,000 in cash, subsequent payments annually of money and materials. They particularly liked calico cloth. Go figure. I don't know why. That was part of the promise. In return, they were going to vacate an area that included a lot of where Ohio and Indiana are. For 10 grand, that's not a bad deal. And some of the area up along the Great Lakes, like where Detroit is, also where Chicago is now. And they're going to draw a line called the Treaty of Greenville Line. And in theory, Indians stay on the west and north side of that line, and the settlers stay out of that territory. In fact, the government may have intended on enforcing this and doing this, but there's no way they can control the odd settler who goes out on his own. And this happens more and more and more because people want land. So the Indians, and rightfully so, feel the government's betrayed them. The government didn't do it on purpose. They just couldn't control their own people. But at least temporarily, the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, signed a little bit after the battle, are going to temporarily end hostilities. So finally, Washington's shown that he can actually do something about this problem. What else does he have in terms of domestic issues? The Whiskey Rebellion. What's that all about? Reaction to Hamilton's liquor tax. That was in the Hamilton's presentations to Congress. We should tax liquor. Everybody uses it, so it'll bring in a lot of money for the government. But the people out in western Pennsylvania and some of the other far out territories felt this was unfair because they were the people that made the alcohol. Well, why would they be the people that made the alcohol? The reason being is that they were a long way from marketplaces. If they grew crops like corn, sorghum, things of that type, rye, which is all good for making bread and different food and things like that, they had to drive that a long way to get it milled and even further to sell it. It was a long, risky drive. We had no road network to speak of. It was so much easier just to build stills, distill it, make liquor out of it. That fit in much smaller containers. It was actually worth a lot more and much easier to sell. They didn't have to go all the way to Philadelphia to sell it. So they relied on those sales. And the problem with that is that when you slapped on the liquor tax, they felt that they were the only people being taxed, and they were paying for all the rest of the country. So this is an east-west regional issue. And a bunch of guys are going to organize, and they're going to form a group called the Whiskey Boys, and it was apparently a large group. I have no idea what their numbers were, but they threatened to take over the city of Pittsburgh. And in 1794, George Washington issues a proclamation declaring that they're all committing treason, and he calls up a large group of people. I can't remember what they called them. There was a special name they called them. It'll come to me about 2 minutes after class is over. But it was almost 13,000 men from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. He's going to put them under command of General Daniel Morgan of American Revolution fame. One of his lieutenants will be a young man named Meriwether Lewis. We'll mention him much later, see if you can remember when we get there. And they're going to put this rebellion down really fast. Not a whole lot of violence. They arrest some of the ringleaders. They're brought to trial, convicted of treason, sentenced to death. When the dust all settles, and this procedure takes a while, when the dust all settles, George Washington pardons all of them on condition that they go home and shut up. And that's a pretty good deal if you're about to be hanged, you know. They say if you'll go home and shut up, I'd probably agree to that. But he showed the ability to deal with a big problem like that and the ability to get through it with a minimum of bloodshed and that sort of thing. But he's showing his ability there. Problem is, the argument between Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson, the effects of the French Revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion, all of this is going to start building more and more of a divide between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And Jefferson's going to resign from the government in 1793, saying that he can't put up with some of Washington's policies. He respects George Washington. It's not disrespectful about it, but he feels that pulled in a different direction. Those are some of the things that are happening, and Washington's worried about this. He's going to talk about it later. The election of '92, the Federalists will put up Washington again and John Adams again. Now they're going to have a new group. They're Jefferson's group, basically. They're the Anti-Federalists mainly, but they're called the Democratic Republicans. Both of them are both still factions. They're not really parties as we consider parties. They're going to also nominate George Washington. What's that all about? Well, Thomas Jefferson was afraid if Washington went home that nobody in the government would listen to anybody else, whoever else was elected. He was afraid the whole country would fall apart. He was an anti-federalist, but he knew we needed a central government. So he begged George Washington, run again. Washington wanted to retire. Figured he'd done enough. 8 years of war, 4 years as president. But he runs again. And so both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans nominate Washington. It's a shoo-in. For vice president, the Federalists nominated John Adams, as I mentioned before. The Democratic Republicans will nominate George Clinton, the governor of New York. Adams and Washington are going to win, easily. Now, Washington has issues in foreign affairs, and he's going to have to worry about these. Britain still has those outposts along the border that look to me a little bit on the map like they're in our territory. We have problems with Spain over our southern border. They want to claim all the way up to the 34th parallel. I never have fixed this slide. We have trouble with the Barbary pirates on the Caribbean taking our ships. We have no one to protect our ships, and we have no navy. And we still are worried about something that started right when Washington came into office, the French Revolution. We don't want that bloodshed to spread to our country. French Revolution breaks out in 1789. By 1793, it's got really violent. The French have kicked the king off the throne, Louis XVI. They've declared that France doesn't have a king anymore. 1793, after Louis XVI tries to escape to England or someplace, and he's caught in the act of trying to escape, they put him on trial for treason. They call him Citizen Louis Capet, which was the family name. They execute him on the 21st of January, 1793. All of Europe gasps. Why? Because all of Europe was ruled by monarchs. They don't want this disease to spread to their country. At the end of that year, Marie Antoinette, the king's wife, is going to be executed, and other members of the family will be executed. And a lot of people with aristocratic titles will be executed. And then the executors will be executed by other executors. It gets really scary. In between 1793, 1794, now all of Europe is trying to control this, make sure it doesn't spread from France. So England, Prussia, Austria, all these countries are going to be at war with France. They call it the Terror. The Terror will end sometime in 1794 with another less violent revolution called the Thermidorian Revolution. You don't have to learn that. Robespierre, the leader of the Terror, is going to be executed. A group of men, kind of a committee, will run the country for a few years, the Directory. Eventually Napoleon Bonaparte is going to be in control. Not yet. Not yet. Washington's not really happy. We're having issues with the French. We're having issues with the British, and he's going to have to deal with it. One of the things he's not happy with is the French, our ambassador in France is a fellow from Virginia by the name of James Monroe, rather. Washington's going to call James Monroe home, and he's going to try and replace him with a person that he thinks might be a little bit more forceful. Meanwhile, developments continue. Washington declares total neutrality in this. He did that in about 1793, 1794, 1793. Hamilton says, if you declare neutrality, we have to throw out the treaty we have with the French. He wants to go to the Senate and have the alliance thrown out, abrogated. Maybe that will make the British a little bit happier, and they'll stop taking our ships, because the British are capturing any of our ships that they think might go to France. Sometimes they're capturing them right off of our coast. Jefferson doesn't want to do away with the alliance. He doesn't want to go to war with Britain, but he figures if we have that alliance, maybe we can use it as leverage against the Brits to make them behave. Washington doesn't want to play all these diplomatic political games. He just tells the American people, we are neutral, stay neutral. Don't get involved in this. But our neutrality is challenged when the French government sends a guy by the name of Edward Charles Genet over to the U.S. He actually gets here in 1793. That's at the beginning of the Terror. In the normal course of events, if you're an ambassador, you get papers from your government that you deliver to the foreign government where you're going to serve as ambassador, which say, please accept this man as our ambassador to you. You have to present those papers to the government before you're really an ambassador. Once they accept it, then you function as the American president's personal representative to that government. When we notified the French of that, they sent this guy Genet over. He didn't come and report his papers. He started down in the South organizing clubs to support the French fight against the rest of the world. He actually spent money outfitting privateers. In other words, you take a cargo ship and you stick cannons on it and all that, and make kind of a semi-official pirate out of them, and send them out to attack British ships. Washington won't put up with this. That's a violation of our neutrality. He asked Thomas Jefferson to take care of it. Jefferson's pro-French. Doesn't like doing this, but before he leaves office in 1793, he calls in Citizen Genet and tells them to behave or else. But Genet doesn't behave, and so he's declared persona non grata. That's what that P and G is on there. That's what we all call it. Those of us who are in the diplomatic trade call it P and G. Usually you get a note from the host government saying you have been declared persona non grata. That means you've been declared an unwelcome person, and you have a certain period of the number of days or hours to get out of our country. Unfortunately for Citizen Genet, the government in France had rotated again. Girondists were out, the Montagnards were in running the government, and they wanted to meet with Citizen Genet, perhaps to arrange for him to have an interview with Madame Guillotine. So he suddenly decided he didn't want to go home, and he begged the American government, "Don't make me leave, please, I'll behave." And so we granted him political asylum, probably one of the earliest instances of official political asylum. As far as I know, he behaved. I do know that he married the daughter of the governor of New York, George Clinton's daughter, and apparently lived a productive, quiet life. But we still have this problem with our neutrality. The Federalists in particular were afraid of the French radicals. The British issued this declaration about neutrality. Americans, if you want to be neutral, you have to use our kind of neutrality. See, we wanted to be neutral, we wanted to do business with everybody. But the British said, if you want to be neutral in a time of war, then you can't do business with any of the belligerents, any of the people involved in that war. We didn't like that because it cut us out of money. So Washington's going to try and solve this and other problems. And he sends an experienced diplomat, John Jay, who was the guy that was our representative in Spain during the American Revolution. He'd been kind of in charge of our foreign affairs under the Articles of Confederation, at least for a while. So off he goes. Washington tells him, get the British out of the Northwest. Get reparation for the loss to American shippers during the terror, during the period 1793 to 1794. Get compensation for the slaves that the British freed at the end of the American Revolution, maybe about 4,000 of them. And get them to stop interfering with us doing business in the Caribbean. The British were involved in a war against France. They didn't give a hoot what we wanted. And they were a little bit hard to negotiate with. Jay did his best. He got the British to agree to leave the Northwest Territory by 1796. That's about a year and a half in the future. He got the British to agree to compensate American shippers who'd lost cargo to British warships. He told the Americans we could legally do trade on British possessions in the Caribbean. We had to agree to help the British get paid for debts, pre-revolution debts. We also had to agree to the British interpretation of neutrality. No business with any of the belligerents. We didn't want to do it that way. We had to agree to that. And we were told we could forget about being compensated for freed slaves. Jay comes back with this when the word gets out to the public about what this treaty suggested that we have to do. Jay was not a popular man in America. But the president decided, well, it's the best of a bad thing. He asked the Senate to ratify this treaty. It's good for, I think, 7 years. Then it will keep the British from taking our ships. One other thing they were doing is they were taking our sailors off of our ships, claiming that they were escaped British sailors who had deserted. Some of them were, but most of them weren't. So We didn't cure that problem. One of the unintended results of the treaty with Britain, that Jay got, was France was upset. They considered that we were supposed to be their allies. We had a treaty of alliance with them. I don't know when we officially abrogated that treaty. I don't know if we did. It kind of died. And they're going to start taking our ships. Mainly, their excuse was they were ships that were bringing supplies to Britain, their enemy. Washington's going to have to figure out a way to deal with that. One way, by the way, before I put this or discuss the slides right here, one of the things that all of this did was force us to need a larger navy. We had no navy to speak of. And so in 1794, Washington's going to get an act passed in Congress. We'll just call it the Naval Act of 1794. It allows the construction of 6 frigates, which is the second largest type of warship under sail. 3 of them will actually get built before Congress decides it's too expensive and pulls the plug on the program. The 3 that get built are the United States, the Constellation, and the Constitution. One of those is still floating. Which one is it? Nobody knows? It's berthed at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. It's been to Washington, D.C. It came to Washington, D.C. on the bicentennial, the 200th birthday of the United States in 1976. Still floats, still seaworthy. It's the Constitution. It got the nickname of Old Ironsides. They use it for training, as a training ship for some. That more or less temporarily solved the problem with England. We're still losing sailors, but you only heard about that if word got back that they took them. So the American people weren't aware of that problem to any great extent. The other problem we had, international problem we had, pressing one, was with the Spanish in our southern border. And Washington's going to pick another pretty good diplomat by the name of Thomas Pinckney. And he's going to go down over to Spain, and he's going to negotiate with them. Now, in terms of Spain, we had more leverage than we did when we were negotiating with the British, because the Spanish were vulnerable. They were worried about what was going on in France, and they didn't have much military available in North America to protect their territory there. So they were more than happy to sign a treaty that the Americans would observe that guaranteed that we wouldn't take their territory away. So they recognized the 31st parallel as being the border instead of the 34th. They told us that they would not impede our use of the Mississippi River. Remember, right after the American Revolution, they blocked the Mississippi off at New Orleans. They told us we could use New Orleans as a stopping off point if we wished. And both sides in this agreement agreed to stop using American Indians as proxies to go across the border and fight the other side. Pinckney comes home. He is a big hero because he got us a big hunk of land and settled issues with the Spanish, at least for the time being. He didn't settle their ambitions. So Jay's Pinckney, it served its purpose to some extent, but it wasn't popular in America. Pinckney's treaty was quite popular. It was also called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. That's where they negotiated. So what has Washington done? Well, he organized the national government, pretty much underwrote national credit to make sure we had that, recovered some territory, especially the territory down south that the Spanish were claiming, stabilized the frontiers to some extent by sending Mad Anthony Wayne out to fight the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And we gained 3 new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee, before he went out of office. But he's going out of office. He did not want to run again. He said 2 times is enough. He'd already done 8 years leading our military and 8 more years leading our government, and that is a taxing proposition at the very best. By the way, did anybody know that our former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, passed away? Just, I guess yesterday. I just noticed it in the news. He died from COVID, by the way, or complications caused by it. In 1796, the Federalists will pick the sitting Vice President, John Adams, and Thomas Pinckney, the hero of Pinckney's Treaty, to run for President and Vice President. And Alexander Hamilton wanted to be nominated President. He thought, after all, I'm the guy with all the ideas. But a lot of people didn't, it's not that they didn't trust Hamilton, they didn't think he was suited. They didn't think he was stable enough to be the president. So they passed him by. Hamilton gets upset with this, and he decides that it's all John Adams' fault. And so he tries to persuade certain people that were voting on the Federalist side of things to hold back a few votes so that Pinckney would get more votes than Adams and therefore become the president. But it backfired. Adams' support was too strong. He's going to get elected president, but Pinckney won't get elected vice president. So what you have is Adams in first place, Jefferson in second place. On this chart, he calls Jefferson a Republican. Historians call them Republicans, Democratic Republicans, and Jeffersonians. You take your pick. They're not like modern Republicans. It's a whole different kettle of fish. At any rate, the results of this election, especially after Hamilton monkeyed around with it, is that we have a Federalist president and an anti-Federalist vice president, which seems on face value not to be very healthy. And I bet John Adams wished he didn't get elected, because he walked into office and there were a lot of things hanging fire that hadn't been solved. Our problems with the French hadn't been solved. The French were taking our ships. By the day that he was inaugurated, in March of 1797, the French had already captured 300 American ships. And he's going to have to figure out how to put a stop to this, which is a little tricky since we had no navy, and we had no army, and we had very little money. Washington, on his way out of office, makes a speech. By the way, you have it in your readings. Anybody look at the readings yet? Did you see that they're there in your notes and readings? He warns against foreign alliances. He said, look what the alliance with France caused us. We almost got dragged into their war with Britain. Says, treat everyone the same. Good faith and justice. Don't have allies out of habit. And he also didn't like the idea of party politics. He thought that divided our country. It's already all right to agree or disagree, but don't form teams to do it. Boy, was he right. There's John Adams. He wasn't very tall. He probably felt a little bit inferior when compared to George Washington, because Washington was a big guy, tall guy. Adams always was very careful how he dressed. Some people thought he was pompous, but he wasn't pompous. He was just trying to maintain the dignity of his office. Not much like his friend Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like dressing up, didn't like wearing wigs. Adams was a Federalist through and through. He was pro-English. He'd served in England as our ambassador after the Revolution. He didn't like Hamilton, and you can probably figure out why after you saw what Hamilton did during the election. He had a problem. We still didn't have a process for getting rid of cabinet members when a president left office. Nowadays, it's regarded as automatic, right? When a president goes out of office, the new president appoints new people for the offices. So Adams is going to inherit George Washington's second string. What do I mean by that? Washington had appointed pretty strong people for Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and all that, but they had long since left, either retired from old age or left because they were busy doing other things, like Alexander Hamilton. So he'd had to pick replacements, and when he picked those replacements, the guy that helped him pick them was his personal protege, Alexander Hamilton. So all these guys that were left over were loyal to Hamilton, but they were on John Adams' cabinet. In particular, Timothy Pickering, Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott, the Secretary of the Treasury. Adams is only going to replace one person. He's going to replace the Secretary of War. Other than that, he's going to keep the same cabinet. That's going to cause him trouble, and it's going to take him a while to learn that lesson. He's going to try and be a middle-of-the-road president, a president for everybody. He tries to get along with Jefferson. They were actually friends before they got to this high a position. But as time goes on in Adams' presidency, their friendship is more and more strained until they get to be down and out, just outright opponents. And in the next election, Jefferson's going to run against Adams instead of with him. All through this 4 years that Adams is president, the Federalists are losing ground. They're fading. And the crowd around Jefferson is getting larger. And they'll start calling them the Democratic Republicans. Some people just call them the Republicans. Adams got to deal with something called the quasi-war with France. Quasi just means partial or part way. Because the French kept on taking our ships. Told you 300 by the time he became president. We sent an ambassador over to France. His name was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. I think this was Washington's idea more than Adams, but the French government won't receive him. So he goes over to France, tries to meet the French Minister of State, Talleyrand. Talleyrand seems always to be busy, so he can't produce his papers. If he can't produce his papers, he's not the ambassador. So we have no ambassador over there. Adams is going to try and solve that problem. There's Minister Talleyrand. He's the French Minister of State. He more or less runs things. King doesn't. He's corrupt. He's very wealthy. The revolution's going now. He's still the foreign minister, even though the revolution, he's like a Teflon man. Nothing touches him. Other people with titles get their heads chopped off. He survives. I think the old rule about you have to have enough money and you can survive almost anything. He wouldn't talk to Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So Adams is gonna send 2 more men to join Pinckney, figuring that the 3 of them can work together to find some avenue by which they can get Pinckney's papers presented. They're in the hotel together. Someone comes knocking at the door. It's 3 gentlemen that we always call X, Y, and Z. The reason that people back then called them X, Y, and Z and not by name is because if you accuse people by name, you're subject to court cases and duels and all sorts of things. These 3 men show up and tell Pinckney, John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry, the 2 people, Marshall and Gerry were the 2 people that Adams sent to help Pinckney. They tell them, you just don't understand how things work in France. If you want to meet our Minister of State, you have to grease the palm. 250 grand to each one of those 3 gentlemen in order to set up a meeting. And then they had the temerity to suggest, oh, and by the way, if you want him to take anything you say seriously, it would be a good idea for the United States to offer to loan France $13 million to help them pursue their war. The Americans are miffed, insulted. They decide 2 will go back to talk to the president to tell him what's happened. 1 will remain in France. They do just that. The president tries to keep it inside his cabinet, but it's leaked to the Congress. The Congress, of course, is strongly Federalist. They're outraged. France has insulted our sovereignty. France is taking our ships, etc., and they want to go to war with France. And John Adams, being a responsible president who's shifted more and more towards the middle, says we can't go to war with France. Number 1, this sort of thing should be settled with diplomacy anyway. Number 2, we have no navy. Number 3, we have no army to speak of. We have no way of projecting power. We have no leverage. So we have to do this diplomatically. Only they seem not to be able to. And this is hanging over Adams' head. At the same time that the Federalist Party seems to be fading away, and people are starting to say, Mr. Adams, you're the president, why don't you solve this problem? So he and Congress come up with a partial solution. In theory, it's to protect our security against the overflowing of the French Revolution. In fact, it's a ploy to limit the power of the people around Jefferson. It's called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Let's look at the other side of that. I got a better slide. The Alien Act, passed on the 25th of June. The Alien Enemies Act, passed on the 25th of June. The Sedition Act, passed in July. The Naturalization Act, passed in June. The Alien Act said if a foreigner in our country is bothering our government, damaging our welfare, the president has the right to kick him out of the country. The Alien Enemies Act said that if a person is a citizen of a country with whom we are at war, the president has the right to incarcerate them, put them in jail, or to kick them out of the country. The main people this is focused on are the French, because that's where all the immigrants are coming from to get away from the French Revolution. We also passed the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act made it illegal to conspire to block the government in carrying out its duties. interfering with federal officers, making false, scandalous, and malicious statements about the government or its officers. This involved the powers to arrest them and punish them financially, fine them. Think about this. Sedition Act. You can't make false, scandalous, and malicious statements about the government. Who defines whether it's false and malicious or scandalous? I guess the government. So basically they're saying you can't say anything bad about us. Boy, if we had a law like that in America, half of our country would be in jail most of the time. A lot of people said you're walking all over our First Amendment right of free speech. Two such people, one is the Vice President, another is his protege, John Madison. They come up with an idea. Let's get some of the states to formally object to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So Jefferson goes to some friends he has in Kentucky. Madison goes back to Virginia, and they get support in the state legislatures to pass resolutions condemning the Alien and Sedition Acts. They're called the Virginia Resolution or the Virginia Resolve and the Kentucky Resolution or the Kentucky Resolve. A year later, there's going to be a second Kentucky Resolution. We'll get to that in a minute. What do these things say? Well, in general, they say there's limits to what the federal government can do. And they come up with this word, this theory. Here's their theory. I want you to be able to repeat this back to me if I ask you. There are limits on what the federal government can do because all the states are equal partners in this agreement we call our Constitution. And if the federal government goes too far, then the equal members to this agreement can get together and block it. They call this interposition. Other people would argue that the Constitution is not an agreement between states, but it's an agreement amongst the entire population of the Americans. It's an agreement amongst the American people. The following year, a second Kentucky Resolve is passed in December 1799, and this goes a lot further than the first two resolutions. It comes up with a new term. The term is nullification. The nullification is what happens when one state, any one of the equal members of this partnership that they keep talking about, if that one state decides that a law is unfair to that state has the power as an equal partner to nullify that law, at least inside that state, to make it null and void. I don't think I'm sure that Jefferson and Madison had no intention of trying to nullify a federal law or anything like that. All they were doing was expressing how far this argument could go and expressing the fact that they don't like the Alien and Sedition Acts. But this word nullification, once it's raised, it's like letting a genie out of a bottle. Can't get that genie back in the bottle. About 30 years down the line, it's going to bite us where it hurts. Since he can't solve the problem with France, and since this Alien Sedition Act thing is pretty unpopular, Adams is going down in approval, public approval. We didn't have polls then, anything like that. looks like he might not even get his party reelected to the presidency or anywhere in the executive branch. What to do about this? Well, what he's going to have to do is campaign a little bit harder for the presidency. And we're coming to the election of 1800. It's a nasty, nasty campaign. The Federalists tell everyone, if you elect the Democratic Republicans to office, this country is going to turn into a rabble. It's a mob. It will be part of the French Revolution. There'll be killing and bloodshed. The Democratic Republicans said we have to watch very carefully because what's left of the American military is all pro-federalist, and if it looks like they're going to lose the election, we may have trouble with the Army. We've avoided that in our history because we've very carefully made the point that the Army, that the armed forces are subject to the control of the civilian government. Nevertheless, we have an election, and it's a strange election. Yes, John Adams lost enough prestige that he's not going to get reelected. What are the results? Adams will get 65 electoral votes. Pinckney will get 64. Jefferson will get 73. So he should be elected president, right? Well, no. Because Aaron Burr got 73 votes too. Someone messed up. When they nominated their man, they're supposed to have an arrangement by which somebody doesn't vote for the guy that they want to be vice president so that he comes in second. But he's tied. This goes to the House of Representatives to be settled. They vote 35 times and they can't break the tie. Before the 36th vote, Alexander Hamilton decides he really doesn't want to see Aaron Burr elected president. It has to do with some things he knows about Burr. He considers Burr to put his own personal interests ahead of the country's interests. Burr organized a bank. There was a scandal in that bank. He thinks that that tells you that Burr's got some weaknesses of character. So he starts a campaign, kind of a smear campaign, going around whispering in ears saying, you really don't want Burr to be president. He urges several state delegations, if you can't vote for Jefferson, just don't vote. Burr's doing the same thing, but he's not as good an arguer as Hamilton is. He's not liked as well as Hamilton is. Hamilton's going to win this little debate. And Congress is going to elect Jefferson president. Burr will be vice president. Burr blames Hamilton for this. It wasn't just Hamilton that was involved in this, but Burr blames him. Okay. Now, the election's over with. Finally, John Adams figures out that I don't have to be Mr. Nice Guy and all of that. And he's going to straighten out his own cabinet. He's still president, remember. He's going to fire his Secretary of State. He's going to change out his Secretary of War. He's going to take more direct control over his administration. He's going to tell Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, come home. Thank you for your help, but come home. He's going to find another diplomat who's got better relations in France, knows his way around, named William Vans Murray. He's going to send him to France. Mr. Murray will skillfully do a little tap dance, get around Talleyrand, get all the way to Napoleon, who's in charge over there at this stage of the game, just become the #1 man in 1899. And Napoleon who is busy trying to gain control of places like Spain, Prussia, and expand French influence all over Europe, is too busy, says, look, I'm busy with this work. Just give me the treaty, I'll sign it. And so he signs an agreement to end the French attacks on American shipping, et cetera, et cetera. And word comes back to Adams, and everyone's cheered by it, except for maybe Adams, because if only it had happened before the election, he probably would have been reelected. Nevertheless, he continued to act in what he thought was the best interest of the country. So now the French problem is temporarily over with. Everything's temporary. Thomas Jefferson is the president-elect. Who's the president on the first day of January in 1801? Somebody. Who's the president? Yes, it's a kind of a trick question. It's not really a trick question, but who's the president? Didn't Jefferson just get elected? Then who's the president?
Jefferson.
Adams.
It's still Adams.
Jefferson hasn't been inaugurated yet. John Adams isn't finished yet. He sees that the Federalist faction are not going to have anyone in the executive branch in high office. They're not likely to have anyone in Congress. They're going to lose a lot of seats in Congress. So where to put them so that they don't totally lose influence? And he decides, with the help of friends, let's put them all in the judicial branch of the government. To do this, he gets the Judiciary Act of 1801 passed, and this is going to create 16 new circuit courts, appoint 16 new Federalist judges, and add a lot of other jobs for Federalists. It also gets John Marshall appointed Chief Justice of the United States, and puts 42 new JPs, Justices of the Peace, in Washington, D.C. It infuriates Jefferson, but since he hasn't been inaugurated yet, he can't do anything about it. They call it the Midnight Judges because the joke is that Adams did this at the stroke of midnight before Jefferson became president. We'll carry on with this next time. So somebody write down on their notes, Midnight Judges. So I start in the right place and don't repeat too much. And we'll start out talking about the Democratic Republican presidents. We might even do a war next class. Thank you very much for your time.